Our health matters. It shapes how we live, love, work, and plan our futures. Every day, we learn more about how human health is deeply connected to the health of our planet and to the actions of others around us. We are vulnerable, interdependent, and bound together across generations. In this conversation series, we speak with experts from around the world about these connections. This is an initiative of the Global Health Justice postdoctoral programme at Goethe University, Frankfurt. Welcome to Our Planet, Our Health.
Well, hello everyone and welcome to Our Planet, Our Health. In these conversations, we explore how our health is shaped by the planet we live on and by the choices people and governments make around the world. Today's episode is about why animals matter for pandemics and other health emergencies. I'm glad to be joined by Chef Sebo. Chef is an associated professor of environmental studies, affiliated professor of bioethics, medical ethics, philosophy, law, director of the Center for Environmental and Animal Protection, director of the Center for Mine, Ethics and Policy, and co-director of the Wild Animal Welfare Program at the New York University. Wow, this is a lot and impressive. I hope I'm not skipping anything. And thanks a lot for being here with us today and for joining this conversation.
Of course. Thanks so much for having me.
Well, first, I would like to ask you about your work in your book, Saving Animals, Saving Ourselves. In this book, you argue that in the Anthropocene, the geological epoch in which human activity has become a dominant force on the planet, we are turning the entire world into our backyard. In the thought experiment you propose, a variation of Peter Singer's famous drawing child gaze or thought experiment, you propose that we should imagine that we built a pool in our backyard, we are ignoring a gap in the fence, and some animal jump the fence, and now he is drawing. So this is your thought experiment and your starting point for developing your argument in that book. And if we extend this thought experiment to our current epoch, the Anthropocene, the backyard is not longer our house, but the entire planet. And under these conditions, trillions of animals end up drawing as a result of our actions and omissions, and possibly and probably trillions of future generations of animals are going to end up the same way, right? At the same time, we know more, and we have now a lot of technological capacity than ever to reduce or repair this harm, often without sacrificing anything significant. You also claim that the Anthropocene blurs the line between what counts as natural harm and what counts as human-caused harm. So what all this mean for moral responsibility? This is a big question. And how should your argument translate into public policy, ethics guidance, and into our everyday life?
Yeah, great question. And again, thank you for having me for this conversation. So as you note in the start of my book, when I developed this thought experiment about you build a pool in your backyard and you leave a gap in the fence and a family of deer wander through, a young deer falls in and starts drowning. And I ask a simple question: do you have a responsibility to save this drowning fawn, assuming that you can do so without sacrificing anything morally significant? This does descend from the very famous thought experiment that Peter Singer offered about 50 years ago in his essay, Famine, Affluence, and Morality, where in his version, you are walking by a pond and you see a stranger, a drowning child. And your question is, if my choice is between continuing on to work and letting the child drown versus saving the child and getting my clothes a little bit muddy and being 5 minutes late, what should I do? And there has been debates for the past 50 years or so about that question, where some people think you should, of course, save the child if you can do so without sacrificing anything morally significant. Whereas other people say, no, the child is a stranger for you. You are not responsible for this predicament. And so it is optional, but not required for you to save the child. Now, in my thought experiment, where this is a deer instead of a human child, and the deer is drowning in your pool instead of a pond, there are two elements that are different. One is this is a non-human animal instead of a human. And the other is that you are, to a certain extent, complicit in or responsible for the predicament of this animal. You built the pool, you built the fence, you left the gap, despite knowing that deer wander through your yard. And the reason I started with this thought experiment is, first of all, to note species difference does not fundamentally change the calculation. There is still sentience, agency, vulnerability, caring relationships in their family to be considered. And second of all, fine, we can debate if we have a responsibility to help strangers when we have no complicity in their predicament. But we should all be able to agree that we do have a responsibility to help strangers, to save strangers, if we can do so safely and effectively when we are complicit in their predicament. And then, as you say, it might be easy to tell that when you have a pool and a fence in your backyard, and a little bit harder to see that when we radically reshape the world and our actions and practices and policies are affecting everyone everywhere, directly or indirectly. And so my thought is that while it might be clear that you have a responsibility to help this drowning fawn, to save this drowning fawn, given your obvious and direct complicity in their predicament, it is equally true that we collectively have a responsibility to help or to save the many trillions of animals who are now suffering and dying due to human activities more generally: agriculture, deforestation, development, the indirect effects, public health emergencies, environmental emergencies, biodiversity loss, climate change. And what it means for our practices and policies concretely is simply that we need to consider the interests of animals who are affected by the decisions that we make. And that might mean food system transformation so that we can help farmed animals and public health and the environment at the same time. And it might mean infrastructure transformation so we can help humans and wild animals in the environment at the same time.
Well, that was really useful. Thanks. Taking that you are mentioning collective responsibility, this seems a kind of responsibility in your argument that is a responsibility as a human species or as member of the human species. And I am aware that when we are talking about responsibility at the collective level, this raises a lot of challenges or problems or arguments. We see this, for example, when we try to hold current members of a country responsible for actions committed by their predecessors, like, for example, in the context of the climate justice debate, when we discuss about if we are responsible for the historical emissions that were did by our predecessors. And people often respond saying that, okay, these were my predecessors. There is very little I can do now and currently to change the system I have inherited. How this kind of challenges translate when we are talking about responsibility at the level of humanity as a species? And considering that we don't have institutions representing this collective right, and how should we think about individual and collective responsibility in a system that we did not choose?
Yes, that is a really, really important set of questions. And I think part of what makes this such a difficult situation is that when we think about the harms of pandemics, when we think about the harms of climate change, when we think about these global activities of human practices, the people who cause the harm are generally very different from the people who endure the harm. And that makes it difficult to make them feel responsible for changing their behavior, to see the effects of their actions and to see themselves as having a moral obligation to show some respect and compassion to the individuals who are being affected. Because these problems, they affect people across nations, they affect people across generations, and they affect people across species. And that means that we need to build governance structures, governance institutions for considering the interests of all affected parties, including non-human stakeholders, non-participating stakeholders of all kinds. We simply lack those resources, those institutions right now. And so for me, that makes it difficult, but not impossible to make progress. And it shows that what we need is a systems approach where people are taking very different approaches and trying to make very different forms of progress all at the same time. We need informational changes, education and advocacy to change hearts and minds. We need financial changes, more subsidies for better industries like plant-based farming and fewer subsidies for worse industries like factory farming. And we need regulations banning the worst excesses of these harmful industries. And then we need those basic reforms, building mechanisms for considering the interests of non-participating stakeholders and decisions that affect them. I think that will involve international governance. We will ultimately need a role to play for bodies like the United Nations or other international parties so that they can coordinate activity across nations. But I expect that we will have to start with local and national and regional. So starting with our cities, having our cities procure plant-based foods in their schools and put bird-safe glass on their windows. And then it bubbles up from cities to states, and it bubbles up from states to nations, and it bubbles up from nations to international communities. I think that is the most promising path forward so that we can actually have the global coordination that we need.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I'm also thinking that at the municipality level or local level could be easier to implement some governance innovations. For example, someone representing the interests of animals in local councils at the city level or community level. That could be a good strategy.
I think that is exactly right. The right way to think about it is different levels of government have different roles to play in change. And international bodies like the UN, they are more conservative and slower moving, but they could still have a useful messaging function if they simply say animal welfare matters, animal health and welfare ought to be considered in sustainable development governance and other decisions that affect animals. And then meanwhile, cities are actually being policy innovators and incubators and taking risks and performing experiments and trying different ways of supporting food systems and trying different ways of building infrastructure. Then I think this is the right kind of collaboration between the lower level kind of city governments and then the higher level global governments.
Yeah. That sounds great and not impossible.
Not impossible. Very difficult, but not impossible.
And now I would like to move to the to pandemics, which is a topic that I'm doing some work on. And we know that for preventing pandemics, we need surveillance and containment strategies. And many bioethicists have pointed out that these measures raise serious ethical concerns, particularly because many hotspots, so those places in which we should focus or direct our surveillance and containment measures, are located in disadvantaged countries. For example, in Malaysia, in the case of the Nipah virus, or in Brazil, in the case of the Zika virus. So, but the description of this problem and also the responses were put in human-centered terms. And I wonder if we expand the moral cycle as you propose, how do you think that this can change the way we build or we describe this problem? Could the hotspots be the same if we consider animals? And how might this affect the moral justification for this kind of pandemic surveillance and containment measures? And the direction they adopt considering these hotspots?
Yeah, great question. Part of why it helps to consider animal health and welfare in decisions that affect them is the familiar One Health observation that human, animal, and environmental health are linked. And that means that we need to study and promote animal and environmental health in order to better understand and better promote human health. And when we do study all of those types of health at the same time, human, animal, and environmental, we can find co-beneficial positive sum solutions that we might not see if we think about human health alone. We might appreciate, for example, that there are ways of reforming the food system. There are ways of building infrastructures that prevent conflicts between humans and other animals, that can give us food that we value without harming animals, without amplifying antimicrobial resistance, without amplifying the emergence of infectious diseases, without amplifying biodiversity loss, without amplifying climate change. And then similarly, we can build ways of coexisting with other animals in cities and thinking of them as our fellow residents, our fellow citizens. And then we can all benefit from beautification of parks and overpasses and underpasses and markings on windows that prevent collisions that are bad for humans and other animals. Whereas if we think about human health alone, then we miss those connections. We miss opportunities to improve our own health and welfare, but then we also miss opportunities to improve our health and welfare in ways that can benefit other animals too. If two things are equally good for humans and one is really good for the pigeons and the other is not good for the pigeons, then we should pick the one that is good for humans and pigeons. And the same is true of other animals too. So whether the specific choices of hotspots would change, whether the specific policies would change, that would probably need to be considered on a case-by-case basis. But I think the fundamental observation is that we are not the only stakeholders. We are not the only individuals whose health and welfare matters. And because our health and welfare matters, we need to consider their health and welfare too, just to promote our own. So I think we have all of those reasons to alter our policies by considering them as well as us.
Thanks. This is great. What thing that I would like to comment, it's about the role of animals in the pandemic agreement. And even when the pandemic agreement incorporate and recognize the One Health approach, the majority or the main focus on animals is put in them as drivers of infections or drivers or factors or sources of risks of spillovers, but not on them as as relevant stakeholders. So yeah, this is a pity, and it could be a good opportunity to review this in the context of that agreement. But my next and final question is inspired more by your last book, The Moral Cycle, where you begin comparing two court decisions, and also by the fact that you are also teaching law. How do you see that law and bioethics can work together for incorporating this approach and for expanding the moral cycle and generating the governance mechanisms or structures that you are having in mind? And more specifically at the methodological level, my colleague, Norbert Paulot, has argued that in applied ethics, there is a gap between the principles and the application of these principles to each case. So you can identify the principle and also the responses to the cases, but the process by which we achieve a particular conclusion for a particular case is not really accessible or transparent. And in the legal arena, we face the same kind of challenge. But legal theories, we worked a lot on this. So what we can learn from law and legal theory that it could be useful in this context. And I'm from a country, from Argentina, in which court decisions trigger really rich public deliberations. And my fellow citizens are always discussing, considering each argument used by the court members for achieving one solution or one decision or a different decision. So I think that it would be great to have more of this in moral theory if we want to engage people and if we want to open the discussion and the debate, right? So I would like to ask you, how do you think this connection can work in favor of your approach?
Yeah, these are great questions too. So in the moral circle, I argue that we have a responsibility to extend moral consideration to a vast number and wide range of non-humans, including all vertebrates, mammals, birds, reptiles, amphibians, fishes, many invertebrates, including cephalopod mollusks like octopuses, decapod crustaceans like lobsters, even insects like ants and bees, and even some near future AI systems. Not because they definitely are sentient, agentic, and morally significant, but rather simply because, given the best evidence available to us right now, there is a realistic, non-negligible possibility that they are sentient, agentic, morally significant. And so we should give them a little bit of the benefit of the doubt, a little bit of respect, compassion, consideration in the spirit of caution and humility as we try to advance our understanding of their capacities and moral status. Now, you ask how ethics and bioethics can interact with the law in making progress on these issues. And there are so many directions we could take this conversation, but I think I might simply make a couple of points to directly respond. One is the general point that I think part of what is wonderful about interdisciplinary work is exactly what you suggest, that every field has something to offer. Fields in the humanities like philosophy, in the social sciences, including law, in the natural sciences like cognitive science and computer science. And the biggest problems that the world faces require multidisciplinary thinking. It requires participation in the humanities and social sciences and natural sciences. And so when we can put the fields together, it helps a lot. Now, with these fields in particular, one thought that comes to mind is that in philosophy, we benefit from regularly making a distinction between theory and practice. And so when we think about this distinction in the case of ethics, asking an ethical question in theory is a matter of asking who really deserves moral consideration and what really do we owe them, all else being equal. And then when we ask a question in practice, we have to bring a bunch of other factors in, like the limits on our knowledge and the limits on our power and the limits on our political will. And then we realize, oh no, in theory, we have really big responsibilities, but in practice, we have really big limitations. And so we need to find a way forward that honors our big responsibilities while staying mindful of our big limitations. And I would like to see more explicit acknowledgement of that distinction than I sometimes do in legal discussions about, for example, legal personhood and rights and other fundamental forms of legal status. Because I often, for example, see judges and courts say, clearly non-human animals should not count as legal persons with legal rights, because if they did, the courts would be overwhelmed and so many industries that we depend on would collapse. And these are practical considerations, not theoretical considerations. And it might simply be true that many individuals deserve to be recognized as legal persons with legal rights, and that we presently have a very unjust society that is built on the exploitation of these individuals, where it will take a long time to eliminate that exploitation. And so I think legal conversations would benefit from the same nuance and precision that we sometimes have in these ethical conversations, where we simply say, we should aspire to recognize these individuals as legal persons to the extent that we can, but we will have to take that one step at a time because we have all of these major limits on our knowledge and power and political will.
Thanks. This is real clear, and now I'm thinking in, and I know that I already said that the previous one was the last question, but I would like to ask you something else that is about the role of class in the social analysis of the sensibility that we develop towards other humans or towards animals. Because when I was a law student, I remember, and I was doing some social work too, I was part of some kind of organization representing really poor people who were criminalized because using horses for collecting garbage, and they do this for living, and they were in a very disadvantaged position. And at the same time, there was other organization defending the rights of these horses, and also promoting the criminal cases against these people. And I was surprised how they were sensible, not giving a lot of consideration to the horses and not to these poor people. And which could be the role of classes and in the way we develop these different sensibilities, and in the way we plan the strategies and advocacy around this topic.
Yes, I completely agree with you. When I mentioned before that it helps to think about human and animal and environmental health and well-being together, I mean that partly so that we can pick solutions for humans that are also good for other animals, but then also partly so we can pick solutions for other animals that are also good for humans. Because when we think about only one issue, we really do risk doing harm to other important issues. But when we think about all of them together, then we stand the best possible chance of finding those co-beneficial positive sum solutions. And so when it comes, for example, to avoidable exploitation and extermination of other animals, that is clearly wrong. And I think we should prioritize resisting that and reforming that. When it comes to unavoidable exploitation or extermination of other animals, people who have no other way to find food or medicine or livelihoods, then that is a slightly different story. And I think there can be space to say exploitation and extermination of animals is still harmful, is still in many cases wrong, to be avoided at all costs, but to recognize that those who need it to survive have a better claim to those practices right now than those who are doing it because they enjoy it or because they have formed the habit of doing it or any other reason like that. And so for me, I want in my own work to focus on what I take to be the most important, the most neglected, and the most tractable issues, the areas where we can help as many animals as possible while improving public health, while improving the environment, but do it in a way that involves just transitions. Do it in a way that takes care of farmers and workers and consumers. And on the international stage, this extends to lower income countries to the global south. And so I think we are going to need some redistribution of wealth, some support for countries in developing sustainable alternatives to animal use industries. And in the meantime, there should be a little bit of grace for people who do rely on animal use industries. And if we could just decide to work together to end factory farming and industrial animal agriculture and these other avoidable and harmful practices, then we can take the next 30, 40, 50 years to find alternatives to the other tougher cases as well.
That is great. Thanks a lot for your responses, and thanks for the great work that you are doing. I think that is really good for us as humanity, to see a way in which we can plan having a better role in the future in this planet. So, thanks. Thanks for being here.
I really appreciate it. Thank you so much for the conversation.
And thanks to our viewers too for being part of this conversation and join us next time on Our Planet, Our Health. Thank you.